afternoon, and welcome to this session, Blaming Troubled Families, Licence to Parent, which is sponsored by the Institute of Ideas Parents Forum and part of the After the Riots strand, which is jointly sponsored by that forum and also the Institute of Ideas Social Policy Forum. So thanks to both of those forums for the stimulating ongoing discussions around the issues that we are discussing today. My name's Alison Small. I'm chairing this discussion today, which is looking at the issues around troubled families, which were seen, at least in part, to be responsible for the riots last summer. So since the riots, we now have a Troubled Families Initiative to deal with the 120,000 families coming out of that. We have consensus that parenting skills need to be taught to parents, and also that what happens to a child in their first 5 years stamp them for life. And with so much emphasis on problem families and this parental determinism, the case for the state taking greater responsibilities for families is growing in strength. So I'd like to introduce our panel today. First, on my far left, is Roger Grafe, OBE. He is the CEO of Films of Record, a high-end documentary company he founded in 1979. He's an award-winning filmmaker, criminologist and writer, and best known for his unstaged observational films in normally closed places like boardrooms, ministries, prisons, probation, family therapy, special schools, social work and care homes. His films have influenced policy in areas such as policing and criminal justice. To my left, we have Sally Gimson. She's a Labour councillor for Highgate Ward in Camden. She sits on Camden Council's Planning and Housing Committees and has just been appointed the Council's Education and Equalities Champion. Until September 2011, Sally was Head of Public Policy at Victim Support, and she was previously Director of Communications at the Family and Parenting Institute. On my right, we have Jane Sandman. Jane set up the Institute of Ideas Parents Forum in October 2006 with two other parents, looking at why parents weren't just left to get on with bringing up children, but were constantly being told by outside experts what we should do, yet we were always getting it wrong. So this forum has gone from strength to strength, has looked at all sorts of issues from are turkey Twizzlers bad for your children, through to discussions about developmental psychology. Jane has written the foreword to Standing Up to Super Nanny, written by Jenny Bristow, published in September 2009, which was written as a result of the Battle for the Family strand at this conference in 2008. First, Roger.
Thank you for the introduction, but actually the films that are most relevant to this, and I've made quite nearly 20 films about young people and children at risk. And also I was on the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Commission for 3 years, which produced Brighter Futures as a report on this, and discovered how little awareness there is of children's mental health problems, especially in the two areas, disciplines which are most likely to encounter it. One is teaching and the other is in medical schools. They have almost no training in recognizing this stuff. And then in the films I've made films like Teen Mum High, which was about, as you can gather, teenage mothers being kept encouraged to stay at school. We had a scene in that in which there was a 12-year-old giving birth and counting the baby, 5 generations of women in the home birth, including the great-grandmother, and all of them had babies at 15 or under. And then I made films about early years development and trying to help I made a film called Breaking the Cycle about 3 to 5-year-olds kicked out of infant school, right? Kicked out of infant school because of the problems they had at home. And then In Search of Law and Order looked at young offenders, and because of my interest in what was causing young offenders to offend, particularly the hardcore that do most of it, we looked at a school called the Mulberry Bush School, which I commend to all of you if you're interested, at a film called Hold Me Tight, Let Me Go. That's for 6 to 11-year-olds, the most disturbed in Britain. So I've had a number of years looking at disturbed children and what might feed this. And then most recently we made 3 films in Coventry Children's Services, one called The Child Protectors, and then Kids in Care, which you might have seen, and The Trouble with Adoption, which the Prime Minister saw and decided he was going to speed up adoption. And what we learned from that at the end of all this, and meeting the birth mothers of children who were being taken into care, was that there is a clear flaw in the social contract around children. And the contest between the rights of mothers to have children, and the rights of children to have a happy and safe home life is real. And as we are talking right now, in the course of this hour, 3 children will be taken into care. A child is taken into care every 22 minutes. In the course of the next 3 days, a child will die at the hands of a carer or parent as well. So more than 100 children die a year. In those circumstances, that's 1 every 3 days. So we are not talking about safety. And the word care has lots of problems with it because of the shortage of fosters, the shortage of social workers, the shortage of family court judges, that since Baby P, the number of cases applying for adoption or fostering has gone up by 50% and no increase in the family court judges. So if a baby is taken at birth, it will take a year before that child is properly adopted, even if they're lucky enough to find an adopting couple. And they are put through all sorts of hoops. Out of 60,000 plus in care, 3,000 every year are going to be adopted. Okay? So what we have is a kind of curious mismatch between the rights of the mother to have children, and I understand that impulse. I have 2 of my own, and I'm very proud and love them to bits, but also the care system ends up absorbing 60,000 a year, if not more. And the treatment of those children seems to me to deprive them of their rights. You've heard, all of you, about the Rochdale, the children who were groomed from the care homes there, and other stories like that are up and down the country. The police knew about it for years, did nothing, and there's a kind of acceptance of the limbo in which children in care are put, simply out of sight, out of mind. And to me, this is a kind of disgrace. I mean, really a disgrace, where we are letting these children down, and they're going to have a lifetime of difficulty if they're unlucky, and the lucky few who end up in safe and loving homes have a fine life, and I know adoptions that have worked very well and fostering as well, but the majority are under this terrible pressure which is growing all the time. And it seems to me we have failed to understand the consequences of mothers just producing babies and then not taking responsibility for them. And in the adoption film we have, there's a woman who had 7 children, all taken into care, and very nice woman indeed. We filmed her several times, and she was a loving mother when she was reunited with 3 of her children. And get this, those 3 were waiting 3 years with an adopting couple who gave them back without a reason, suddenly, like that. Just turned them back into the hands of the council, city council, and they were allowed to see their mother after 4 years of absence. It's an incredibly sad scene, but at the end of these 7 children, she had herself voluntarily sterilized. So what I would propose is, although there is a real problem about who decides what, I would like voluntary sterilization to be much better known. 10,000 mothers do it every year in the UK. 150 million are supposed to have done it worldwide, according to Mary Stopes. But it seems to me voluntary sterilization at least offers women the opportunity to have sex, to have a normal life in other respects, but not bring somebody into the world who they won't look after. So that the meaning of motherhood to anybody who keeps their children is different when you lose them, and the pain of losing them is acute and never goes away. And so it seems to me we will lessen the burden on the state, lessen the number of children who are having unpleasant and difficult lives and pushing a boulder up the hill the whole time, and also give women back a certain level of dignity.
Sally.
I'm a councillor in Camden, and I've been there for about a year, and I'm chairing a panel at the moment. I'm both the equalities champion, but I'm chairing a panel at the moment on welfare reform. And welfare reform in Camden in particular, because it's a central London borough, is going to have a very dramatic effect, at the beginning at least, on a small number of our families, who most of whom are going to be living in private rented accommodation, and who would have where their rent would have been paid through housing benefit, and particularly with the total benefit cap, which is coming in April next year, simply won't be able to live in our borough. And also next year, in October next year, what's coming in is universal credit, and that means that everybody will get a maximum of about £500. A family will get a maximum of £500 a week to spend on their rent and everything else. Now, in the rest of the country, that's the average wage, and it's fine, but in Camden, it's very, very hard with high rents to be able to do that. And some of those families as well will be some of the sort of complex families that we've been talking about here. One of the challenges on this welfare reform panel that was made to me by someone who gave evidence to us is, what is your policy going to be with some of these very difficult families? What are you going to do when they turn up on your doorstep? They've spent all the money in that they're getting for universal credit in the first week. They have no money left. You've got a small pot of discretionary housing money that you can give them and a small pot of social fund money that you can give them to tide them over. Are you going to use this spot of money on a very small group of families in Camden to keep them there because they're complex families and because you're doing work with some of these complex families? Or are you going to say, actually, what we're going to do is we're going to fund much more little pots of money to a wider variety of families in order to keep them in Camden and to help them get through? Are you going to, is it about giving £200 a week to these families, or is it about giving sort of £20 a week to sort of a much bigger majority of families to help them out? And if you don't do that, then those families, those complex, those difficult families, will not be able to stay in Camden. They will have to leave. And we will effectively be getting rid of some of our complex families in Camden. What should our policy, with limited resources, and you've got to decide where to spend it. And as a council as well, we have very limited ways of raising money. The money we're getting from government is being cut by about £80 million over the last sort of few years, and it will continue to be cut. So our resources are getting smaller and smaller. Sorry? Childminding numbers are cut, lots of numbers. So we're getting limited resources, and then the government's cutting money to us. Then the money to our poorest families are being cut. So what do we do? So that's one of the sort of dilemmas that we as a council are going to, and that's the kind of sort of policy that we're going to have to look at what we do, and I think have a policy about that, because we can't have people saying, well, you're rewarding delinquency ultimately. What you're doing is you're giving money and you're giving resources to the most difficult families, but to us who only need a few more hours work or need help out when things are rough for a few weeks, you've told us that money's not there and you're spending it on these difficult families who are not only difficult and perhaps and you might consider undeserving, but are also making our lives hell on the housing estate in which we live. So I just want to put that out there in a sense, in that's one of the kind of dilemmas that we have and haven't yet formulated a policy about that. Don't know yet, and actually don't know what the scale of the problem that we're going to face is going to be next year and onwards, because obviously a lot of these welfare reforms are being phased in until 2017. The other thing I wanted to do is make a kind of plea for, we've also got an equalities task force as part of looking at equalities in Camden, making sure that we don't allow this kind of thing to make us a borough which is more unfair than it is at the moment. Although once you start thinking that poorer people can't live in the borough, then it's interesting, because then of course you get a more equal borough because everyone's just very rich. But we're looking at this, and one of the things we're looking at is where can we help most. So most children who live in poverty, for instance, live in poverty because their mothers don't work. And one of the things that we could do to help parents and to help people earn more money is universal childcare within Camden. And the other thing I think, which comes to Roger's point, is I feel very, very strongly that we need to do something about mothers' mental health, because actually the mental health of mothers is what affects the mental health of the children. And if we had a policy generally throughout the country saying that we put a huge priority on mothers' mental health to keep them healthy, and that is where we would start to solve all sorts of problems, parenting and otherwise, all the way down the line. But that would be universal. That would go from the richest to the poorest. But if we did something about that and concentrated on that, then we might begin to solve some of these other problems, rather than be very literal about it and saying this is just about parenting or something else.
Thank you. Okay, Jane.
What I want to do is just look at a bit broader, and picking up perhaps some things that Roger and Sally said, but is about intervention into parenting. And I think it's interesting that the only tangible policy that came out of the aftermath of the riots was the Troubled Families Intervention Programme. And it was an immediate reaction. And so the first thing I think it shows is that increasingly our reaction to anything is rather than a big social competing complex solutions, we do try and look as a society now to a very deterministic, simple and causal one. And I think it seems it's so much easier to blame things on the family. As David Cameron said in his 2011 speech about the riots and families, a small number of families are a source of a large number of problems in society, and what is required is a clear, hard-headed recognition of how the family is going wrong. And I think both right-wing and left-wing commentators agree that poor parenting is a big social problem. For the right-wing, they describe it as a lack of moral fibre in the poorer sections of society, and for the left-wing, I think it is the problem. They say it's a problem of poverty that creates poor parenting. We heard some of that in the discussion this morning. But I think it all ends up the same way. Poor people are poor parents for whatever reason and need state intervention to get them to parent properly. But I think, however, I think the outlook is wider than this. And I think, Sally, quite interestingly, it started to say, well, we do need wider national strategies for parenting, be it rich or poor people. Everyone needs to fall into a parenting strategy. And I think the bigger message is that parents need state support to help them bring up their children correctly, no matter whether you're troubled or no matter whether you're well off. And what is the problem with this point of view? I think for society it means that we don't engage with what is taking place and how do we imagine how we improve things if our answer is always to blame it on the parents and bring more and more intervention to the family. But I think also by having this outlook and having these strategies, it continually undermines family relationships and creates and exacerbates a situation where parents are to blame. I think the riots did show a complete collapse of authority from everyone. State agencies of the police and the fire brigade looked on while hoodlums burnt homes down in front of them. And I think there was absence, with notable exceptions, of responsible adults stepping in, including parents, within the riots. I think it is legitimate to ask where the parents were in this and why couldn't they stop their children from rioting. And we did see a generation on the streets in August 2011 who had no self-discipline, no sense of boundaries having been set around them, and it's all for free and it's all for me, seemed to be the outlook as they took their trainers from JD Sports. But every solution, once it enters the realm of the parenting strategy and parenting put forward, I think further undermines parents' ability to have authority over their child and further undermines the expectation that children could and should know the difference between right and wrong. The state stepping in to tell us how we should parent, having experts draw up guidelines for us, assuming that we cannot make judgments as to how much TV our children should watch, what food they should eat, what tone of voice we should use, makes parents question their ability to do the right thing for their child. So an example I want to give is the Scottish National Parenting Strategy. The Scottish Government has committed to develop a national parenting strategy for Scotland. I mean, they're always in the vanguard of these things. So this is just a page. So this is the Scottish Government saying, this is why we need to develop a national parenting strategy. This is what parents are struggling with, and this is what they need expert advice on, and we as the government need to give them that advice and help them. So they say parents looking for advice on nappy rash, teething, what activities they can do with their children, how to feed them, what nappies to use, how to get their children to sleep at night, and relationship advice. So it just assumes that pretty much every basic function that goes with having a baby and living as a human being is something that cannot be done, worked out, imagined by parents, but instead there needs to be a strategy of intervention. And this constant telling us we are incapable to work these things out for ourselves. There is a right, expert way to do things. And if we don't follow that way, we could be damaging our children for life. Not unsurprisingly, does undermine our confidence as parents and does undermine our authority as parents. How are we to lay down laws in our own home when we have the voice of the expert in our ear telling us we have used the wrong tone of voice and will now have irreparably damaged our child's sense of self-esteem? And I think again, it was referred to in the discussion this morning, 5-year-olds have a sense of that. They come home with letters from their teachers telling us that we have not put the right food in the lunchbox, for example. So even from quite an early entry into primary school, there does suddenly become, actually, I don't know whether mommy and daddy do know what is best for us, and we feel undermined about that. And I think the other side of it, at the same time, young people are cast as vulnerable individuals who must be sheltered and protected from any event in their life. For example, David Lammy, in his book, Out of the Ashes, suggests that there should be a week's parental leave when a child goes to secondary school. So the very event that used to mean a child was growing up, and it might be in a pretty problematic first few weeks, first term, but it was them growing up and having to learn independence, is now recast as an experience they need to be protected from. And the longer we treat children like children, where will they ever learn responsibility? So the more the family and parenting is elevated as the panacea to social problems, the more the state intervenes in it, because it says this is the most important thing that is going on, and the more, ironically, undermines the family. At the extreme end of society, there are those, and there are some really troubled families, but who are now pretty much managed by state agencies. I agree with Roger that the amount of intervention into some families now, it's in loco parentis, and so they increasingly can exercise little autonomy over their lives and are not expected to be autonomous by the state or themselves. I mean, there's a whole network. But on a wider level, it is every parent. We all have examples of where we behave not as we wish to with our own children because we're worried about what they think of us. The riots last summer showed that this constant colonisation of the private sphere by the state isn't working. It is not making us better individuals with better outcomes. It is undermining adult authority and creating a youth with no sense of boundaries. Instead of demanding more parenting classes, more diktats for early child rearing, what would society be like if we assumed parents could cope, they did know what to do, and they were the best people to bring up their own children? I can see that Roger has something to say, but before you come back in, I'd quite like to get some more thoughts from the floor as well, and questions and comments.
I strongly disagree with Jane. I just want to register that right now.
Okay, that's fine. I'll come back to you soon.
Okay, that's fine, yeah.
I had the misfortune actually to work in the Families at Risk division within the Department for Education, which was a real eye-opener. One of the experiences that I wanted to feed back on was talking to someone in a local authority who recounted an example where a family, mother and father, were taken into a room and they were confronted with over 18 professionals all wanting to give them advice about their life. And then this person in the local authority who's nominated as the Families at Risk contact was also told that he had to be there. The point about this is this person said to me that this family were just absolutely overwhelmed by these very well-educated, eloquent professionals telling them what to do. And there is a real profound inequality with people, this family, who are trying to say, well, we're trying to do a good job here, and being undermined in every single way. And the really interesting thing about that is a lot of the professionals directly challenge traditional sources of authority within the family, especially grandparents. So when they're interfering in these families, the grandparents who actually may have a degree of expertise, being able to offer them some advice, they are labelled by the professionals as the real people to get out of the way so that they can get in there and do their job. And I think that is really awful.
I guess my question's more for Roger than anybody else, but I'd be interested in others' observations on it. My understanding of one of the reasons why there is this spike in children being taken away from their birth families and put into the care system or prospective children for adoption is because there has been a sea change in the understanding of what you're supposed to be addressing within social work and more broadly within social services, away from Winnicott's idea of good enough parenting and Winnicott's view that as little should be done unless it's absolutely necessary to intervene in the family, and that we should also look to wider family networks first, to a version of, well, a reformulated version of Bowlby's attachment theory, focusing in particular on an expanded definition of neglect. And my understanding is that when families are now being assessed, an entirely different model and approach is being used. And it's on the back of that that we have this spike in babies and children being removed from their parents. That's described as simply a legitimate response to baby P. I was wondering if you thought that shift in the underpinning in relation to psychological development and ideas about the child is legitimate or itself more troubling than the troubled families.
I mean, I tend to take my starting point as saying you shouldn't blame the parents from my sort of political past and understanding of the world and all the rest of it, and I can appreciate the focus that you want to make is the one that Jane looked at in terms of state interference. But at one level, do you not have to say, actually, parents should be ashamed if they can't raise their own children? Is that not a kind of logical end point to the idea of having a more responsible society where people say, actually, it's a disgrace that that woman is having her kids taken off her by social work again and again and again? So that ultimately, logically, we have to say shame is positive, because shame has a sense of people saying we should have standards and expectations of ourselves which are greater than they appear to be for some parents. And certainly the state doesn't seem to have very high standards of expectation for parents, which obviously that's a key thing you can actually say in terms of the interference and level of parenting support. Which is a kind of difficult thing to argue, but is there an argument for shame within this discussion?
I'm going to I'd like Roger to come back now.
First of all, the collapse of the community as a functioning body, which started with the urban redevelopment after the war and knocking down all sorts of working class communities that worked, where you could leave your door unlocked, where people would look after each other's children, and then putting them into tower blocks where they didn't know anybody and where they were frightened to go out themselves, and the children couldn't play on the grass. This is a country that doesn't like children. This is crucial, the whole thing. What kind of country says children should be seen but not heard? Well, they're seen and heard during the riots, and everybody says shock horror. But they're actually the cutting back of Sure Start, the cutting back of expanding the numbers that childminders will look at unregistered, which is a plan at the moment. This kind of thing is systemic neglect, brewing trouble. And I just want to say that it isn't. I mean, the gentleman who described 18 professionals trying to, overwhelming a family at risk. Of course, that's shocking and it's bad. But in terms of the question about Bowlby versus Winnicott, there is a culture war going on inside social work right now between those. And I've watched families who are being encouraged and helped to keep their kids to the last possible moment. But what they're terrified of is a baby P moment in which suddenly the whole policy will be discredited because of one, very serious omission by all the services, not just social work. But there's a kind of level of paranoia that's real. So the problem becomes not whether you just leave parents to cope, because all the parents, literally I say almost all, it's really virtually all, the parents over the years of the offenders I've worked with, or the young kids at risk and so on, they want help. They don't feel patronized. They're desperate for support of some kind or another, by a grandparent, by a neighbor, by a friend, by somebody who has this information. And the woman who ran this school, the Princess Margaret, it's called the Marlborough Day Centre in Swindon, and has been closed because they privatized it after 25 years as the only place for disturbed children, in the whole of the Southwest. It's been closed now. The woman who ran, Sally, was a worker. She said, I've just come from taking my kids shopping. My child was screaming on the floor of the supermarket, and I didn't know what to do. She said, there is no handbook. You don't, you buy a washing machine, you get a handbook. You have a kid, you don't know about nappy rash, you don't know about that, and you certainly don't know what to do about crying and behaving in public. And all the people whom you see shouting or in desperation saying, stop, come back, don't do this, don't do that, 10 years later, when that child is 13, they really don't have control. And if the child is bigger than they are, they're really scared. And the age range at 13 means the peer group takes over. And unless you've embedded collective community values that are going to sustain up against the peer group pressure to misbehave, which applies across all social classes, by the way, including the bullying group, you have trouble. And I will, if we have time, Alison, list the factors that predict future offending when a child is 10. But harsh and erratic parenting is the top of 10 factors.
Okay, Jane, would you like to come back on that?
Yeah, just quickly on those two, but I think it does relate to the gentleman's first comment about the grandparents, because I think increasingly the sense that there is folk knowledge, or there is a set of knowledge from friends, grandparents, particularly, I think, that sort of intergenerational learning is now dismissed. And I think, unfortunately, children are looked more like as washing machines. Children are not washing machines. That's why there didn't used to be a manual. There is a relationship and a love and a experiential situation, and now increasingly it is as if a child is a washing machine and there is a set of instructions, and those instructions are provided by experts, and the grandparent perhaps saying no, do it like this or whatever is completely dismissed because they are not
it's
the
not
washing
true.
machine instruction manual.
It's just not true, Jane.
Okay.
The kinship
Can we just let
care.
Jane finish?
Sorry.
Just let Jane finish
And
the question.
just picking up on the... I mean, the baby P moment, I think you're right, Roger. I mean, you know, the increase of children in care is increasing exponentially. And I think there are two things around that. I think there is the fear of the baby P moment. You think just how awful, let's just reflect on that, how awful from a fear of, as a society, we can't, occasionally children will die in very chaotic circumstances, and they are so rare that they are imprinted on our brains. There's Baby P, there's Victoria Klimby, you know, we know the names. And to put a whole tranche of children into care because of the fear of those occasional things happening, because we as a society can't deal with it, I think should send shivers down our spine. But the other agenda to that, and as you say, Roger, your film going to David Cameron, is the idea of outcomes as well now, that actually children do have to be taken off their parents as soon as possible, because what matters in a child's life is the first 2 years. So there's a fast rush of adoption. And the thing about family courts, over 90% of adoptions are fought against by a natural parent or a grandparent or some person in that relationship, which is again why the wish to say let's end family courts quickly. So, you know, I think we are, all of those observations are right, but I think we should reflect what chilling outcomes are coming from that.
Sally, do you want to come back?
I wanted to come back on the grandparent point, because I actually, when I worked at the Family and Parenting Institute, one of the problems that we came across a lot was that actually social workers were very keen to give the children to the grandparents. It saved money, and often they wouldn't. One of the problems that the grandparents then had was that they weren't given extra benefits or extra money to look after these children, and ended up sort of completely transforming their lives as grandparents with these children who were often their own children who were often drug addicts, had severe mental health problems, had severe alcohol problems. Were women who were victims of domestic violence, had a whole sort of myriad of problems, and these elderly people in their 60s were having to take the children back, having to take their grandchildren back, and then they would find that the social workers wouldn't necessarily tell them that they could, I can't remember what it is, but they wouldn't tell them that they could be a guardian, I think, and therefore have the money, get the money. They were just told that this was their duty as grandparents, and the kids were just more or less taken away and dumped on their doorstep. So this idea that the state is actually spending vast amounts of money on trying to control, trying to take away children and their families is actually, the state is trying to save money, and at the moment it's trying to save even more money, and that I think is the biggest worry, that these families won't be helped by therapeutic care from the state in a way that they should be helped, that there will be that they will simply sort of they will be put with not qualified childminders, that they will be given to grandparents, and grandparents won't be given any help with these children, that actually we won't do enough, and we won't invest enough, and these parents with welfare reform will be pushed into even more poverty and find it even more difficult, and mental health places which could help them will be closed down. I wonder whether we're tilting a bit at windmills here, that actually the state is withdrawing very, very fast from this, and we're all of us who are having to deal with this are under incredible pressure, and we're just going to see it much, much worse.
Thank you. I've had dealings with individual children as a head teacher, children whose fathers have walked out usually, and in the family we've had successful and less successful fostering and adoption. One of the things I'm aware of here is Jane's concern about the undermining of parental confidence by the imposition of experts, but also the agreement, I noticed the nodding just now at both ends of the table, about the need for early intervention with children. It seems to me that much of the evidence on which interference in family life is based comes when the child has already suffered. In a sense, it comes too late, and yet with our present legal system, you have to wait until you've got that evidence. I wondered whether there is one point at which an intervention can take place before a relationship is formed between a child and its parents. I think a lot of the discussion the discussion we're hearing here is about the concern with the parents rather than with the child. If when a child is born, before it has a relationship with the parents, you were to ask the parents or ask the mother, do you know the name of the father? Where is the father? Are you in a fit state to provide a home? I think that might suggest ways in which we could move forward, perhaps with a minority, a very small minority of parents, but perhaps in a way that will mark out clearer expectations for parents. One of the things I'm very aware of is that the sort of ineffective parents I came across, and that those that we hear about in the press, would never ever be allowed to adopt or foster other people's children. Yeah. And in extreme cases, I think we have to ask, when the child is born, whether some people should not be allowed to inflict themselves as parents.
What percentage does the panel think of parents or families are really, really messed up, extremely dysfunctional, that really, really need help? I ask that question in all sincerity because sometimes you get the feeling, I get the impression it's maybe about, 10 or 15 or 25% of the population. But my real instinct is much, much less than 0.5%. And the reason why I ask the question is because I also experience this as a teacher in education, that what you have is a model of a very damaged child or a model of a very damaged family, which is basically extrapolated to become sort of mainstream, to become quite a common feature. And it is very, very important to try to answer and deal with that question. So if you take the Every Child Matters, which I think is a disaster, which teachers are being sort of hammered with as well as families, after the Victoria Columbia situation, this basically becomes imposed as the model for how you treat all young people. And so if we bring that back to families, surely if we unlock that question, it tells us that what's happening is we're now getting a very prescriptive formula for families as to how to bring up their kids. And that leads to my second point. Jane sort of said, more or less alluded to this, and let me say it in a slightly different way. Would you all agree with me that parenting is not a science? And if parenting is not a science, is there not a problem with the idea of experts and others coming in to tell you how to bring up your child? And final point, is not the consequence of that actually quite paralysing and crippling for parents in that they start to lose their confidence in their own ability to bring up their children? And what I'm suggesting is, and I mean it in a very sort of positive, constructive way, is not the vast majority of interventions into the family doing more harm than good?
I don't know if it's just me, but I'm finding this a very confusing debate. And I think the reason is that I'm feeling that everything is being thrown into the pot. I really feel we've got the conflation of a lot of different things going on here. So when Roger was talking about the parents who can't cope, the parents who don't know how to put on the nappy, the parents who can't get their children to sleep at night, the parents who've looked at their child having a tantrum in the supermarket and not known what to do, that's me. I'm guilty to all three of those. I still can't get my daughter to go to sleep at night. I can probably just about put a nappy on by now. But that's perfectly normal. That's just the normal wear and tear of having children. You know, you do it wrong one way, then you try a different way. You talk to your friends, and gradually you start to learn. But to jump straight from that to somehow I'm not going to be able to control my children when they're bigger than me, which isn't going to be very long now, just seems to be putting together things that are completely, they don't deserve in the same pocket at all. And, you know, my children go to an inner city state primary school, and I just don't recognise the picture that is being drawn when I look at the other families. There are lots of people who are having difficulties, as I am. They can't get their kids to sleep, etc., etc. But really, they're coping fine, most of them. You know, they swap tips with other families and so on. The main problem that many of them do have is they don't have enough money, and that would definitely help. And anything that can be done without strings attached to give them, you know, better housing, more money and so on, which is obviously very difficult at the moment, would all be well and good. But then, you know, it's really going along the same lines as the question that was just asked, because then we're sort of throwing that into the same pot as a small number of families with very extreme problems. But I think even when we look at the figures when it comes to that sort of pot of extreme families is being exaggerated. We look at something like, you know, how many kids are affected by alcoholism. That's probably my kids as well, because the level, you know, you have to drink to be put into that category is also has been extended and expanded. So we're putting all of this into the same pot. And I think, yes, there are a small number of families who are really, really struggling, sometimes with money, obviously sometimes with a range of different problems, who do need a lot of help. But for most families and for most parents, what they need is to be left alone and not to be overwhelmed with advice.
First of all, I'd like to say that I think Roger hit the nail on the head, for me anyway, at the very beginning, when he pointed out the difference between the rights of the mother to have a child and the right of the child. I must say my support is with the child, because I think the child comes into the world. The child needs a nurturing, loving environment. And the notion that Jane has that all parents are naturally good parents, I find absolutely stunning. It can only come from a middle-class mother, who I'm sure most middle-class mothers have a pretty good idea. There might be different variations. I know that when I was 19, I had a child. And I didn't have any idea. I had no mother, no relatives around. I had no idea how to bring this child. I remember, because I was an intelligent boy, I went to Boots to try to buy a booklet. This was pre-Spock. I could get books on how to bring up my cat and dog, nothing on how to bring up my child. Eventually we worked it out, but I don't think it's a natural gift. And the issue of mental health you mentioned, which I think is a very important one, and I'd like to think that more money spent on mental health would improve the problem, but I'm afraid, speaking as a psychologist, it won't. Strategies for improving mental health are very weak and fragile. I think the only answer is to... sterilisation is an interesting argument. I'm not voluntary sterilisation. I'm not completely sure about that. But the conclusion I came to, and it's a very uncomfortable conclusion, I don't think any conclusion here is an easy one, is some form of parent licensing. We have to have licenses to drive cars. No one ever disputes that, because driving a car is lethal. Being a parent is lethal. It can actually inflict enormous suffering on a child. And that suffering, you may be right, that it may be only talking here about a small percentage, a very small percentage, but 1% of the general population is an awful lot of children living in suffering of different degrees. And that suffering will stay with them in adult life. In many cases. Okay. So parent licensing is what I advocate. I think a lot of problems about that, which I could talk about, but that's the idea.
I'm going to bring Roger back in, because I think there were some interesting questions asked then. It would be interesting, I think, to get a sense of, do you have an idea about the percentage that we're talking about, and whether parenting is a science or not, and whether, therefore, there are a set of skills that need to be learnt and taught, and therefore potentially a licence sort of is the conclusion of that. So
okay, let me start with the comment that the lady is about, I'm conflating apples and oranges, okay? In fact, it's all fruit. And the degree to which early development in the first couple of years does or doesn't create a stable, healthy environment for the child to grow, whose brain would be fed by protein, not sugar, the whole bunch of things which we can talk about, we know requires good, intelligent responses. And that can be across all social classes. I'm a patron of something called I Can, which is a language charity for kids to learn to speak. And all social classes are producing children who don't speak because their nannies don't talk to them if they're middle class, or they just put in front of the telly, and 90% of the children going into a school in Stoke and the entry thing could not speak properly or understand instructions, right, at 6. Now, these are children heading for big trouble. Now, in terms of your question, I can give you some numbers. They're not the numbers about parents, but they're number about offending children. Of the normal group of offenders, of 100% of crime, 8% commit about 70% of the crime, okay? And the predictors of those 8% are the following. I'm sorry to take this time, Alison, but it'll answer the question for people. First, I said harsh and erratic parenting. One or both parents unemployed. Mental or physical health problems or both. Poor housing and frequent moves. Learning problems. Drug and alcohol abuse in the family. Domestic violence and child abuse in the family. One or both parents or a sibling convicted before the child is 10. And that means the criminal justice system feeds the problem, doesn't solve it, and harsh and erratic parenting being the worst of all of those. Now, they grow in a geometric progression. That is to say, if you have more than 2 or 3, it's a geometric progression of your likelihood of offending. So yes, there's a small group, but it's not that small. The issue in numbers is we don't catch them. They're quite good. They're not. The police are hopeless at catching young offenders in the group. And most young offending, this is crucial for the theme of this conversation, happen in groups. It's only when they grow up they start committing crime alone. So we have as a culture, a subculture of kids who are really at risk because of a whole series of social factors, medical factors, psychological factors. Criminal justice system is irrelevant but makes it worse when it intervenes. And I think we have to take more responsibility for the kids at risk, not wait until they start offending and then throw pointless money at locking them up.
Okay, Jane.
Well, I just think just very quickly on the numbers. I mean, obviously, the statistical sampling is very problematic because it's very small. So the number of the 120, the Ruth Levitas report, which is the 120,000 troubled families, was not actually the troubled families. It is very much a number of families that they extrapolated which have troubles, mental health problems at home, scarce resources, and that was then these families are causing the riot. But even the survey that said it's 120,000 families. The sample is so small that it could be plus or minus 2% either way. It could be minus families, but they know that that's not true because there must be in that survey there were some absolute families who had these 6 factors. But you're talking about such a small percentage in which this whole social policy and this whole way of thinking is being elevated, exactly as that gentleman said.
Sally, do you want to?
I sort of agree with Roger that it goes from, but in policy terms, there's the very small percentage of those people who need lots of resources and who have multiple problems. And then there's a sort of scale that goes like that. Then there's a scale that goes like this. And so the families in Stoke are sort of a bit here on the scale. And in policy terms, actually, in many senses, you get a lot more bangs for your bucks on away from this tiny proportion of people who have very, very complex problems. They're probably chronic. They'll go on the whole time. They're interventions like family intervention programs, which are sort of sold to government. If you do this with some families for a year or something, you will solve the problem. Well, you won't actually. These families go in and out of trouble all the time, and they're more or less. It's more or less like having a chronic disease. So you will have some sort of effect, but you'll have to keep funding them, and they're very, very expensive. In policy terms, actually looking at the families just above that, and to the families in Stoke that you're talking about that can't read and write, and who suffer probably unemployment and poverty and some of the mental health to do with that. But if you look at those and the ones before, and you put interventions in there, you actually get much more more universal interventions there. You actually get much more you get much more bang for your bucks. You get these children doing much better, much more quickly. So I don't know whether that's an answer to the question, but there is a big difference between those very, very almost intractable problem families and then problems a bit above that. And it's interesting, in our Equality Commission, we're looking at not the very intractable ones, but the ones just beyond there and saying, can we put in interventions like childcare, like mental health, like better health interventions to help those families start to do a lot better at school. And that's just little bits and pieces of help that would help them work a bit more, would help them.
Thank you.
Just a quick point. I'm rather surprised that marriage hasn't been mentioned in this, because there's been quite a lot politically in the last few years about it. And I'd just be interested to hear what the panel thought about that. And also, just going back to the point that you made, and I think the gentleman back there somewhere said, he made the point about stigma. In order to have a society where the state doesn't intervene too much into families, I mean, obviously I accept in terrible cases there is a need, but in order to not have a society where the state is intervening completely in family life, as you were saying, you do need a strong society. And that does mean, surely, the ability of a society to hold certain moral standards, which may well involve things like stigma, however painful it may be. And if you don't have stigma in a society like ours, where we're very sensitive about making judgments about people in this country, about family life, I'm afraid it does mean that people lose sight of what being a parent is, and especially if they're quite far away from the grandparents and the extended family, it is very difficult for people to know how to behave if they're not feeling that kind of societal pressure. So surely you do need a strong society. You don't want to be cruel to people, but you do have to have certain standards. So that's just really my point.
Thank you.
A lot of the comments that we've heard this afternoon seem to equate professional intervention with an imposition and with a culture of blaming parents. And I want to question that correlation. is it possible to have models for supporting families that are truly supportive, that make parents active in developing their own capacity, perhaps through listening to parents and getting them to talk and them to tell their stories rather than the professionals telling them what to do. That's my first point. The second point is, if we are not intervening as professionals, are we keeping our own skills exclusive? Is it not elitist to keep them to ourselves? I know that with the vulnerable young people I work with, I have to use every tool I've got to get them through the day, and I don't want to keep those tools to myself.
Just a brief question for Jane. I agree with you. I just run into problems when trying to make these points when I'm arguing with other people, because I feel like there's a line when intervention needs to be, where there needs to be intervention, basically, and I don't know what that line is, and when I have a conversation, I tend to lean towards something along the lines of, well, when it becomes abusive, but then the definition of abuse now is so variable that I guess I'd just be interested to hear what you think about that. The response, I really quickly just want to respond to Roger and the gentleman who asked a question to my left. I don't think you need to worry about administering licenses for parenting or sterilizing women, because the way you put a doom and gloom spin on parenting, as a woman in my mid-20s, I can tell you I'm not going to bother. And I just want to say briefly, because the nature of your professions, I do think that you have been a bit exposed to really terrible but rare anecdotes that seem to be negatively skewing your attitudes.
Literally all the young offenders I've worked with over time, I've stayed friends with, and I treat them the same way as I treat my other friends. I don't have that experience, but I feel for them, and I would like to have them, like to pay attention to them sooner than when they end up in court or in prison. That's the point I'm trying to make, and I think we can help them. The science, sorry, parenting is science, not a skill. It's a skill. It's a series of skills, and just what you were saying. And the example I wanted to give you wasn't just Sure Start, it's Home Start, which is one that comes out of Leicester and is based on mothers who've learned their experience, passing that experience on to other people. So it isn't high-powered professionals of a different social class. It's not Lady Bountiful. It is people like them, and that's what used to happen in communities.
Well, I think the state should be providing support for all families, and I think that comes in things like Sure Start. So I think Sure Start, childcare, and not hating women and saying they have to be sterilised or things. So I think we hate children, but we always blame mothers for this. So this just shouldn't be about licensing women to have babies or sterilising women. This should be helping women. It should be helping women to work. It should be helping women with childcare, and it should be helping women to look after mothers to look after their babies.
You know, there are families who struggle and have difficulties, and I am not against universal childcare, non-judgmental. I'm not against, for those children in Stoke you talk about, having great education in which they're taught to read and write with great teachers. What I am against, it seems to be, you might say, well, just listening to parents, but it seems to be those things aren't on the agenda, and it does seem to be an intervention into parents' lives and into how they look after their children as that solution.
They're coming to school not able to speak, Jane.
Okay, we're going
to teach them how to speak.
We're going to wrap up the session there now. Please, could you all thank the speakers? Join me in thanking them.